friends and colleagues. First of all, I would like to say that I feel honored to have received special mention of excellence in the Alberigo Award. And I sincerely thank the person who nominated me. I don't know who it wasn't me. And I also would like to thank very much the committee and the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present my work, despite the circumstances which forced them to cancel the conference in Bologna. In the next 15 minutes or so, I will introduce you to my book, and I will give you some reasons why I think you might enjoy reading it. Thank you in advance for your attention. Indonesia is the biggest Muslim majority country in the world. In 2016, its capital, Jakarta, was shaken by a political controversy because a Christian was running for the office of governor. Suddenly, the internet was ablaze with tweets, posts, and memes which claim that the Quran forbids Muslims to take Jews and Christians as leaders. They referred to verse 51 of the 5th surah, Surat al-Ma'idah, which they translated as, "O you who believe, do not take the Jews and Christians as leaders," based on a widespread edition of the Indonesian government's Quran translation. The candidate, Ahok, tried to defend himself and warn people against the exploitation of the Quran for political ends, which earned him a blasphemy trial and large-scale protests organized by Islamist groups and also exploited by his political opponents, of course. When it transpired that more recent editions of the government translation had chosen to render the verse in question as "do not take Jews and Christians as close friends," there were calls for boycotts and book burnings. Now, avoiding to take Jews and Christians as close friends might create different problems for some Muslims. In 2011, the German Muslim blogger Hakan Turan discussed the same verse, Quran 551, in a blog post. He describes his youth as the son of Turkish immigrants in an industrial town in southern Germany, where nearly all of his friends were non-Muslims, including Italians, Germans, Spanish, and Portuguese. His parents were supportive of this, but one day an elderly Turkish acquaintance informed him that the Quran does not allow Muslims to have Jewish and Christian friends. Years later, as an adult, Turan tried to come to terms with the alleged incompatibility between the Quran and his social life, and wrote this long blog post on potential solutions to this exegetical problem. These range from the semantics of the term in question to the history of the verse, its relationship to other Quranic verses, its Quranic context, as well as the author's private experiences and predispositions. Now, what does the verse actually say, and how come there are such conflicting interpretations of its meaning? O you who believe, do not take the Jews and Christians as awliya. Awliya is the plural of the Arabic word wali, which is today rendered as leaders, friends, and many other things, including allies and helpers. In the original context, it denotes a close relationship that involves some form of mutual obligation, which was important in a tribal context, where you had to rely on others, for example, if you were taken prisoner of war to pay your ransom. It is difficult to translate into modern terms because the kind of social relationship and mutual obligation it denotes does not exist any longer, which opens the verse for many different interpretations that may be influenced by the reader's mindset and horizon. For example, in Indonesia, the translation as leaders emerged in the colonial period and was expressly used to bring across disapproval of those who collaborated with the Dutch. Turkey, of course, does not have a comparable colonial history, which is probably why in Turkish translations you're much more likely to find the term rendered as friends or helpers. This is a fundamental exegetical controversy which is carried out in different media with different results, and quite obviously these results are tied to local social and political circumstances. My book wants to help readers make sense of the contemporary exegetical discourse beyond the hermeneutical, anthropological, and activist approaches that have characterized previous studies, and with a much clearer focus on present-day developments. The study is based on a dozen years of working in the field of Muslim Quranic exegesis with a focus, although not an exclusive one, on the modern period, and a strong interest in linguistic and transregional comparison. I called it Muslim Quranic Interpretation Today because the book looks closely at the exegetical discourse of the last 10 years or so. But I explore this discourse from a historical perspective. I ask about the genealogy of the concepts that are used and the sources that are cited. In fact, my historical interest starts from the very basic question why the interpretation of the Quran is so important today, in ways that I argue only emerged in the late 19th century. I want to contribute to an understanding of the contemporary field without losing sight of its history. I hope to have achieved that by having a clear focus on the most recent developments and then pursuing their genealogies. This approach also helped me avoid the pitfalls of umbrella categories such as modern Quranic exegesis, which is problematic for several reasons. For example, because the contemporary field is not exclusively characterized by modernizing approaches and not even by works that have been produced recently. Rather, the pre-modern exegetical heritage is still hugely popular and widely available, but its reception is rather uneven. It does not necessarily reflect the preferences of pre-modern Muslim scholarship, and it also is often published in an edited and sometimes heavily sanitized form. This is glaringly obvious when we look at the possibly most popular Quranic commentary today, which is the one by the 14th century scholar Ibn Kathir. This is a bookshelf in an Indonesian bookstore containing several editions of this work. Ibn Kathir's commentary has been published in the 20th and 21st centuries in countless editions, pedagogical versions, and translations, typically by Salafi publishers, with a particularly strong contribution from Saudi Arabia. This, for example, is the first volume of a 10-volume abridged translation into English, which is based on an abridged edition in Arabic, and both were directed by the Indian-born scholar Safiur Rahman Mubarakpuri. I ask in my book what agents and institutions are behind the promotion of Ibn Kathir today by producing abridged editions and translations, and what interests they pursue, and how we can find this reflected in the texts, in the choices they make, both in shortening and in translating this text. My analysis of exegetical trends and of the sources and paradigms they use as such is not something that nobody has done before, although they might have used different categories and come to different conclusions, which is quite natural. But I think what is new about my book is that I embed these exegetical trends in their wider structural context that is characterized by a variety of languages, nation-states, and particular types of media. Contemporary exegetical works still include printed books, as you can see on this slide, but today exegesis is just as much or more so carried out in blogs or smartphone apps. The concept of my book is also innovative in the sense that it aims at a symbiosis between analytical chapters and case studies that cover anything from Quranic commentaries in various languages to illustrated children's books. This also makes the book a good resource for teaching. It contains a lot of primary source material, the majority of which I have translated from several languages into English, with introductions and commentaries, and always embedded into a broader analytical context to which they are relevant. For example, I discuss the phenomenon of Quranic exegesis on YouTube based on about a dozen videos on the interpretation of the Fatiha, the first surah of the Quran, as well as a translation and in-depth analysis of one of these sources. This allows me to explore, among other things, the relationship between exegesis and preaching. What does the root of a Quranic interpretation and preaching mean for the style and content of exegesis? How is exegetical authority performed on TV, on YouTube channels, and in front of live audiences? And why, incidentally, is it nearly always male? These are not only important questions, they are also necessary questions to ask if we want to analyze divergent hermeneutical perspectives. Understanding these as purely intellectual trends, as many works on Quranic exegesis do, does not take into account the social basis of their epistemology and authority. Salafis, for example, do not just pursue a different hermeneutical approach from traditional ulama, modernists or Islamists, although they certainly do. But they are also a distinctive social group with a particular habitus, a way of speaking, of dressing, of preaching and performing. This is part and parcel of their approach to the Quran, And the same is true for other trends, including the most recent one, which I define as postmodern. Hakan Turan's blog post on the issue of friendship with non-Muslims is a good example. Turan offers a complex and well-thought-out exegetical discussion that is based on a highly personal approach, which is absent from the typical printed Quranic commentary. He makes it quite clear that he considers his interpretation of the Quran a subjective one, based on his experiences, emotions, social situation, and his needs. This is very much rooted in the medium he uses. A blog is by definition a personal diary, and it lends itself to subjective biographical accounts. I argue that this is the biggest trend we are currently witnessing in Quranic exegesis today. During the past 2 decades, new media have emerged that encourage personalized subjective narratives, with the result that modernist, traditionalist, and Salafi approaches, with their inherent claim to objectivity and truth, are increasingly challenged. Take, for example, Quran 434, which is possibly the single most contested Quranic verse today. The verse is fairly long and it contains several hotly debated issues. Here I will just mention the most hotly contested one, which is the fact that the verse seems to give permission to husbands to strike their recalcitrant wives. This is how exegetes have read the verse for centuries. To be sure, there were some discussions on whether beating should be seen as a last resort and whether the verse refers to light or even symbolic beating. But nobody doubted that the verb used here, daraba, means to hit, to strike, or to beat. This changed towards the end of the 20th century, most notably in the context of Muslim women's activism. An increasing number of Muslim female and male exegetes felt uncomfortable with the verse, either because it conflicted with their perspective on gender equality, or because it gives fodder to Islamophobes who accuse Islam of being a fundamentally misogynist religion. New interpretations of the verse were put forward, and very often these involved a claim to having finally uncovered what the Quran really means, some true meaning that was hidden beneath 14th centuries of gendered exegesis by exegetes whose perspective on the Quran was veiled by their socialization in patriarchal societies. And then a bit later, some protagonists of the debate, especially Amina Wadud, an American Muslim scholar, began to wonder, much like Hakan Turan did in his blog. How can one believe that exegetes for 1,400 years had got it wrong because they had been thoroughly blinded by their socialization in the societies they lived in, while at the same time assuming that we ourselves are free of such intellectual constraints? How can anyone ever claim to be able to tell divine truths from their own conscience, desires, emotions, and worldview? These thoughts and doubts have led to revigorated and quite productive debates, although the gap between postmodern thinkers and those who claim to know the true meaning of the sacred text is wide, and accusations of heresy are freely handed out. Now, one might suspect that this is a debate that merely takes place in Western liberal societies among a limited number of academics, converts, and/or activists. But this is not the case, and one of the reasons for this is the fact that geographical boundaries today have become more fluid than ever. For example, in 2016, Monem Siri, an Indonesian professor at an American university, published a post on an LGBTQ-friendly interpretation of the Quranic story of Lot in an Indonesian blog, right in the middle of a moral panic about gays in Indonesia. His interpretation of the Quran was clearly influenced by queer Muslim discourses in North America, but it elicited a huge exegetical controversy in Indonesia, of which this is just one example. We live in a world of global entanglements, and just like in Hakan Turan's blog post, many exegetical debates span several countries. That is why it was so important to me to offer a global view. The Muslim exegetical field today cannot be reduced to what is happening in the Middle East. We have important Muslim voices in South Asia, South Africa, Europe, and North America, and they are just as much part of authentic Islam as those of Arab or Iranian scholars. Moreover, many of my case studies transcend the boundaries of languages and nation-states. This is true, for example, for exiled scholars in the US, such as the Egyptian Ahmad Subhi Mansour or the Iranian Abdul Ali Bazargan, who produce bilingual exegetical content. It is equally true for global missionary movements such as the Ahmadiyya movements or jihadi Salafism. At the same time, some exegetical endeavors are so firmly rooted in a specific local context that they cannot be understood without a solid knowledge of that context, which today is typically a nation-state context. For example, why would a Turkish Alevi scholar publish a rhyming translation of the Quran? This can only be explained when taking into consideration the respective status of Sunni Muslims and Alevis in the Turkish Republic, which results in a quest for Islamicness on the part of many Alevis. Engaging with the Quran underlines that claim to Islamicness. At the same time, putting the translation in rhyme and using an ancient Turkish meter to do so may appear religiously offensive to some Sunni Muslim scholars, but it also appeals to the extremely powerful ideology of Turkish nationalism. And I'm very much indebted to Brett Wilson for these insights. These examples might have given an impression of what my book aims to achieve, situating current exegetical discourses in time, space, and history. I want to highlight their mediatization and do justice to their linguistic, denominational, and ideological diversity. And I very much hope that my book is as fun to read as I had fun writing it. Thank you very much for your attention.